Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We would like to extend a very warm welcome to each one of you at the nice global conclave from the laps of the beautiful Himalayas, where the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is located. The think tank was established in the month of February in the year 2016. It undertakes independent research in the field of international relations, foreign policy, security studies, and development. NICE has 4 research centers: China Studies, Neighborhood Studies, Non-Traditional Security Studies, and Security and Strategic Studies. The institute focuses on 8 research topics: climate change and energy, global governance, sustainable development and smart cities, refugee and migration, China's Belt and Road Initiative, border and transboundary water politics, Indo-Pacific affairs, disaster management, and international economy and development. Previously, NICE has had the opportunity to host distinguished speakers from all around the globe.
It was a great pleasure inviting me to speak here at NICE.
It's a real pleasure to be able to speak with all of you.
But thank you anyway, and I certainly admire the work that you're doing.
I'm very happy to be with you all.
NICE Global Conclave is the flagship event of Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement. The theme of the 3-day conference is Connecting Nepal to the World, with the aim to bring the leaders, diplomats, business leaders, and scholars from all around the globe. The objective of the conclave is to introduce Nepal to the world and at the same time update the Nepalese policy makers and experts about the fast-changing geopolitics, which will help Nepal reshape its foreign policy to achieve its national goal. This is session B of the conference, titled Gender, Peace and Development. And to chair and moderate this session, it's a real pleasure to have Dr. Swati Parashar here with us. Dr. Swati Parashar is a director at Gothenburg Center for Globalization and Development and associate professor in Peace and Development Research at the School of Global Studies, University of Gothenburg, Sweden. Her research engages with the intersections between feminism and post-colonialism, focused on conflict, peace, and development issues in South Asia and Africa. She has authored and edited several books and journal articles. She's an associate editor of the journal Critical Studies on Security and serves on the advisory boards of International Feminist Journal of Politics, Millennium Journal of International Studies, Critical Terrorism Studies, Third World Quarterly, and Security Dialogue. Without any further ado, I request the chair to take over.
Yes, thank you indeed. Thank you for that lovely introduction and also the video. And I think more than anything, the video makes you really want to have this event in Nepal and not online, just staring into our screens when we see those images, right? So welcome everyone. My name is Swati, as has already been introduced. I'm here, I'm going to chair, rather facilitate this conversation with 2 very important speakers that we have today when we think about gender, peace and security. But before that, I did want to say that from wherever you are joining us, any part of the world, whether it's afternoon, morning, evening, I hope that you have had a good conclave so far, because from what I have followed, the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement, they've done NICE, as you call it. I like the acronym, has worked really well, and they've been, I was just in the previous session, so much good discussion has happened. And I think in some sense, the online space has also opened up opportunities to bring so many people together. Since we are an agenda panel, I did notice that all your distinguished speakers are all men. And I think that's something that needs to be pointed out. So, in that spirit of centering gender, I want to today welcome first two distinguished gender scholars and activists who are going to take us through women, peace, and security. But first, let me let me just talk a little bit about what we are going to address. So today's conversation is going to be centered around women, peace, and security. And you know, there is a lot of work going on in South Asia. There are a lot of thinkers from the region also involved in how this agenda is being shaped, the conversations that are happening in various feminist spaces. It is now considered a global norm, and it in some sense derives legitimacy, if you like, from the Beijing Declaration, from CEDAW, from, of course, the Security Council 1325 and other related Security Council resolutions. And together, all of this becomes the WPS agenda. And feminist scholars and practitioners have argued that this agenda is actually quite central in terms of enabling stakeholders to mainstream gender in policy making and to think about gender as inherent to particularly peace and conflict issues. Of course, the primary aim is to address women's concerns, but you know, the agenda extends far beyond that. It looks at equitable and gender just peace. It looks at international resources, you know, what kind of foreign aid goes into, gender peace research and initiatives. So in some sense, it's a very broad way of looking at contexts, various contexts of conflict and what can be done on the ground, what is being done, taking stock of it. And in some sense, I would argue that it has produced a lot of good research where there has been greater connectivity between the global and what we call the local, right? So that conversation, you know, there used to be a gap between what was happening on the ground in the various conflicts, right? And when these conflicts would transform into perhaps peace processes. But now this kind of dialogue that this agenda has facilitated has enabled scholars who are situated outside, who perhaps engage in more theory and discourse, to be in dialogue with people on the ground who are doing this work. So in some sense, it brings those two levels together. It brings scholars and practitioners together. It is really about prioritizing gender equality, thinking about human rights, both in a domestic setting, but how might that speak to broader audiences, and particularly in the global context. And I think it would not be too far-fetched to claim that it has inspired perhaps the Swedish feminist foreign policy that was launched in 2014. We now also have Canada's feminist international assistance policy. So there's a lot going on there. As I said, it is centered on women, but of course there is a lot of talk of men and masculinity, and I think our speakers will address that. I wanted to quickly also flag off that although it sounds like something exciting is going on in this field, which it is, some of us have been a little bit cautious, a little bit skeptical of how this might translate into on the ground debates, on the ground initiatives that are in place. And I think there is, and some of us have argued that there is a certain coloniality in how this agenda is being approached, as perhaps in some ways marking a hierarchy between the global north and south, and also between the north, which is there in global south, and between the north and south, which is there in global north, right? So there are those kinds of what in terms of what is being visibilized, what aspects of gender peace and security are we talking about, who is talking about it, where are these conversations taking place. So we are thinking a lot about that, and in feminist spirit we continue to foster a dialogic space where we can bring together some of these ideas. We disagree in feminist in the feminist community, of which we are all part of. Laura, myself, Punam, our two speakers today, we have disagreed, we have agreed, we've had differences, but more than anything we agree that this is an important departure point from everything that was there in the past to actually center and perhaps mainstream gender in the concerns to think about peace and conflict more broadly. So these are my initial comments, and there's a lot of work that our two speakers have done on this, which you will be able to access if you wanted to get hold of what they've been writing and talking about. In some sense, there's no dearth of it, so it's also good in to bring them together to talk about these issues here. So without further ado, I'd like to again perhaps start with Laura, who's going to, Laura is professor at University of Sydney in Australia. It is late in the evening there. Thank you so much for joining today. And Laura, if you can take us through the broader debates within WPS Agenda, and then we move on to Punam, who's going to talk specifically about South Asia and Nepal, right? So can we start with you, Laura? The screen is yours.
For sure. Thank you so much, Swati, for the introduction. And I want to thank also the Institute for inviting me to participate in this panel. I want to acknowledge that I'm connecting today from the stolen lands of the Gamaragal people, to which sovereignty was never ceded. And I pay my respects to elders past and present. I'm deeply grateful for their continued custodianship of country, of the land and the waters that I now share. So as Swati has outlined for us, the Women, Peace and Security Agenda is a policy agenda that's anchored in, although is not encompassed by, the 10 UN Security Council resolutions that have been adopted under the title of Women and Peace and Security. And in order to cover some of the debates and the research that has grown up around this agenda over the last 2 decades, I'm going to outline a number of kind of current concerns that I see animating the agenda into the future. So Resolution 1325 built on the existing international agreements and declarations regarding gender equality and the status of women, including the Beijing Declaration on Platform for Action and the Windhoek Declaration and the Namibia Plan of Action on mainstreaming a gender perspective in multidimensional peace support operations. Now, this documentary heritage really draws out for me the way that the agenda is anchored in women's rights and also its genesis in the disparate global practices of women's activism and gender mainstreaming, rather than conforming to a narrative that the agenda sprung kind of fully formed into the halls of power, to borrow Janet Halley's formulation, of UN headquarters in New York. And that's part of connecting the so-called local and the global that Swati mentioned in her introduction. So in this short presentation, I want to talk a little bit about these elements, as I think they've continued to structure and inform the debate over the last 2 decades. And I'll organize my discussion around 3 key claims about what matters in and to contemporary WPS practice for peace, security, and development more broadly. And in brief, I want to argue that the rules matter, culture matters, and funding matters for WPS practice now and into the future. So when I speak of the rules of the agenda, I'm referring to the policy architecture of the agenda itself. And in its simplest form, this is the series of 10 resolutions adopted by the Council over the past 20 years. Although, of course, we know that WPS practice far exceeds these resolutions. And the policy architecture itself is much more diverse. The resolutions themselves, though, are the touchstones of the agenda. The resolutions are the codified and agreed upon version of the agenda that UN member states agree to be bound by according to their obligations under the Charter. So we have 10 now, and they have been hard fought and hard negotiated, and in some cases celebrated, and in other cases been the source of much feminist despair. But in all cases, they have been adopted by the UN Security Council. So here is really where I think the rules matter, and the process of adopting the resolutions is significant. The WPS resolutions, like most instruments of global governance, are drafted and negotiated by a very small group of people. Beyond the representatives of various member states, UN Women has some influence in the process, and the NGO Working Group on Women, Peace and Security, which is headquartered in New York, also has opportunity to have input. But while they're critically important, these voices from civil society are limited by the form and functions of diplomacy at UN headquarters. And because the resolutions become the touchstones of the agenda, the language in those resolutions matters a lot. And we will not be able to expand the agenda in ways that we as a community of scholars and activists find satisfactory unless we diversify the opportunities for input into the creation of its policy architecture. Grounded in Resolution 2242, the UN Security Council is now able to consult with an international expert group on matters pertaining to gendered inequalities and harms in country settings where the Council is active. So the Council is thus slowly opening up to more diverse viewpoints and diverse forms and sources of information relevant to its business. I would like to see the supporters of the WPS agenda continue to push those boundaries and advocate for better representation and more inclusive practice in the formation of WPS rules, because as I have said, they matter. They matter to national governments, they matter across the United Nations, and they matter to the women's organizations doing peace work who can use the resolutions to leverage change in their local contexts. And this brings me to my next point about culture. In terms of the claim that culture matters, I'm arguing here that specificity is important. The recognition of women's agency in diverse political settings, in conflict and so-called peacetime environment, hinges on paying close attention to how WPS is being used on the ground by women and peace activists in work towards justice, equality, and violence prevention. The WPS policy agenda has proliferated enormously over the past 2 decades. From a state-centric perspective, UN member states have national action plans to guide the implementation of the WPS agenda at country level. There are regional action plans governing WPS in regional organizations, and many guidelines and protocols developed by intergovernmental organizations such as NATO and the OSCE. These different forms of institutionalization reflect the priorities and pre-existing peace and security practices of the terrain into which they're conceived. National action plans, for example, tend to reflect national interests and concerns, including in their engagement with security matters that fall under the auspices of the WPS agenda. And beyond national implementation of the agenda, there are regional cultures of WPS governance emerging, with organizations such as the African Union, European Union, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and NATO adopting guidelines and directives designed to produce coherent WPS practice among member states while respecting differences in national priorities. But more specifically, and in many locations, women's organizations and peace organizations work on WPS and WPS adjacent initiatives, often without reference to a national action plan and frequently with very limited resources. And these activities deserve recognition and attention also. In Afghanistan and Nigeria, for example, women's organizations have played an instrumental role so far in outreach and awareness raising, training and capacity building, and facilitating engagement between women and other important actors at the community level in efforts to counter violent extremism without much in support from the national government. In Solomon Islands and Sri Lanka, in Liberia, Finland and Australia, across South Asia and South America, the WPS agenda is being shaped and reshaped, told and retold by women's organizations and in the work that they do. These activities bring the agenda to life and are an essential component of the ways in which the agenda can be apprehended and known. In and through these contexts, various imaginings of the agenda become visible. All kinds of different activities are shaping what the agenda is, what it can be, and how its implementation can transform unequal societies and move communities from conflict to durable peace. As Dr. Shumita Basu has astutely noted, the Global South writes 1325 too. These WPS practices must be visible as part of the ongoing reproduction of the agenda and not simply treated as case studies or sites of implementation, as Dr. Parashar has observed in her important writing on this subject. Finally, I want to comment on how funding matters. Along with some colleagues, I recently completed a study of WPS work, which showed that the unpaid labor of civil society organizations is an essential component of the conditions of possibility of the agenda. Shortcomings in implementation of the WPS agenda are frequently attributed primarily to limited political will and a lack of resources to support implementation. As 2 UN staffers have noted, and I quote, "A lack of financial resources coupled with insufficient prioritization and political commitment by decision makers from national governments and the UN alike are commonly named the key factors for the disappointing implementation of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda." End quote. There is no doubt that the shrinking allocation of resources to women's peace work more broadly and to WPS specifically in an era of increasing austerity worldwide affects the extent to which the goals and objectives of the WPS agenda can be realized. The agenda struggles in the absence of resources and the political will to invest those resources. Professor Carol Cohen observes that true political will and institutional commitment in the form of human and budgetary resources have been in short supply. There is no reason to believe, unfortunately, that we will see over the next 2 decades much of an increase in that supply, particularly in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, when the majority of available resources are being redirected to primary service provision, economic stimulus and recovery packages, and public health initiatives. It is difficult to envisage that national governments or international organizations will begin to provide adequate funding for women's peace work. In our research, we argue that the work undertaken by civil society organizations, which represents a continuation of the mobilization that germinated the WPS agenda, is integral to the agenda's success because funding matters now and into the future. Civil society organizations were instrumental in laying the foundations of and have since supported and pushed forward the agenda. Civil society organizations drafted versions of the first text that became Resolution 1325 and advocated for its adoption. Civil society organizations continue to monitor progress and push for greater implementation and accountability, as well as undertaking research, advocacy, and education. The WPS work undertaken by civil society actors is a form of care labor that nourishes and sustains the agenda, and without which the agenda could not, in fact, succeed. Without adequate funding for this work, the future WPS agenda will likely be the kind of technical and top-down enterprise that we are afraid of in its bureaucratization, rather than the radical and creative agenda for transformation that its progenitors intended it to be. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura. Wish we could all clap, but that was really great. And I think the 3 things that you point out, rules, culture, funding, very critical to the study that you're doing. For those who've joined us late, that was Professor Laura Shepherd from Sydney University, but also Australian Research Council Future Fellow, something that I missed mentioning. And it's a very prestigious, very, very prestigious fellowship in Australia to very distinguished academics working on cutting edge stuff. And Laura's work on WPS is really significant. For those of us who have read your work, I think one of the inspiring things is to unpack how bureaucrats and institutions are thinking around these issues. There is a lot of work on the ground, but also to think about how these policies come into place, the language of those policies. And I think we truly, truly are grateful for that work. So now we will move on from that global perspective to thinking about Nepal and closer home, I guess, South Asia and then Nepal. And we have with us Dr. Punam Yadav, who is co-director of the Center for Gender and Disaster at University College London. Correct me, Punam, but so glad that you are here and take us through what the thinking is around Nepal. Welcome again. And the screen is yours.
Thank you, Swati, for the introduction. And I'd also like to thank the organizer of this very important conference. And also thank you for inviting me to share some of my thoughts. So we are bringing this discussion from the global to the local, and I thought I should share some specifics of how the WPS agenda has been implemented in Nepal. I have prepared some slides, and let me try sharing those, and I hope it works, because if you share it, it just goes everywhere. Okay, cool. Looks like it's working. And
it's working.
Wonderful. So I'm going to be talking about in this 10 to 15 minutes. I hope I'll finish in 10 minutes. Women, Peace and Security Agenda in Nepal. As Swati and Laura already mentioned, that WPS agenda is made up of various resolutions. So there are 10, and I've just listed it here. WPS agenda actually celebrated UN Peace and Security WPS agenda, I should say, celebrated its 20th anniversary last year, for the implementation of the WPS agenda, NAP has been, National Action Plan has been the most common way. There are 92 NAPs that have been developed. The first one was adopted by Denmark in 2005, 5 years after the resolution was adopted. And the newest ones are South Africa, UAE, and Mexico, adopted in 2021. So when the UNSCR 1325 was adopted in 2000, Nepal was in the middle of civil war. But then nobody knew about this until about 2007. Some of the women's rights activists actually came to know about it, and they thought it was very relevant for Nepal. So they wanted to obviously talk to the government about how to go about implementing it. So as a first point of contact, obviously women, children and social welfare ministry, they approached. But then later on they decided that if you go with the women's ministry, this may not make wider impact because it will be seen as women's agenda and not as something important to the society. So then they decided to go to the newly established ministry, that is Ministry for Peace and Reconstruction, which was established in 2007. Initially, when they started the conversation in Nepal, they did not know about anything about National Action Plan. They only came to know about National Action Plan in 2010 when the UNSCR 1325 was preparing to celebrate its 10th anniversary. So in 2009 in Nepal, a high-level steering committee was established. As you can see, I just wanted to lay out the process to tell you how seriously it was taken at that time, at least during the process of developing the NAP. So in 2009, this committee was formed, and as you can see, Deputy Prime Minister was part of it, as well as the Foreign Minister. And that committee was co-chaired by the Ministry of Peace and Reconstruction. The NAP planning first meeting was held in March 2010, which involved various ministries as well as civil society organizations. And there was a technical committee formed, and they had national level workshop, and then they had various workshops. There were 52 district level consultations, and they spoke to 3,000 people and collected 1,500 action points. There were validation workshops, pre-test, as well as various other meetings. So in February, the Nepal government adopted this new National Action Plan on 1325 and 1820. So this was the first National Action Plan in South Asia and second in Asia. So the process of developing a NAP was highly consultative. This involved not only the government, but also civil society organizations, UN agencies, and other bilateral organizations. And therefore, still, even now, it's been seen as one of the most consultative and one of the best examples of NAP. I'm talking about National Action Plan here. There were other NAPs in Nepal, as you can see, I have listed here. But then this NAP particularly received high attention, big attention from the government officials, as well as non-governmental organizations. Why? You would know that there was money for it. So obviously that attracted more attention. So NAP was developed. Let's look at how it was implemented. The process went for a year. Highly consultative consultation took place from Kathmandu all the way to the district level. district level leads were invited, heads were invited, as well as the victims and survivors of conflict were also consulted in a very limited capacity, but they were consulted. However, interestingly, there was no implementation plan. And also there was no budget allocation from any of the ministries. NPTF, Nepal Peace Trust Fund, allocated approximately 7.9 million US dollars, which is a lot of money, but then those money went to 10 projects that were led by 10 different ministries. So these projects were designed without any kind of needs assessment or any other consultations. It was just randomly 10 ministries were asked to submit the proposal, and then they submitted the proposal and got the funding for whatever they asked for. Most of the money went to the Ministry of Home Affairs and Ministry of Defense, maybe because it was coming from the Security Council, and we can get into that debate. I won't have time to go into that details now, but we can make sense of it. Some money went to the Ministry of Education, and likewise, the Women's Ministry got 7%, and then 5% went to the National Women's Commission and other ministries. There are many additional projects implemented by non-governmental organizations. We cannot account for those because there is no record of it. Everybody did whatever they wanted to do, and they brought money from wherever they could. So if you look at this chart, I just wanted to give you some idea about how the projects looked. Most of the projects are maximum 2 years, 27 months this one. And if you look at the nitty-gritty of the projects, these are sensitization, empowerment kind of project. Didn't actually do anything to support the victims or the survivors of conflict. It was very far from the actual needs on the ground. So the first NAB phased out in February 2016. It was a five-year plan. No second NAB has been adopted yet. There is a draft ready, and you know the political instability in Nepal, and there is no appetite for the second NAB anymore. As you know, many conflict survivors are still waiting for justice. Truth and Reconciliation Commission and another disappearance commission collected over 65,000 cases. No progress has been made, and you already are aware of the state of these two commissions. Also need to note that these commissions were actually formed after the NAB already had expired, the first NAB, and there hasn't been second NAB yet. What are the achievements? I mean, it could be contested. There are lots of parallel programs going on in this NAB development. Selected NGOs and civil society organizations were involved, selected ministries were involved. So the outcomes are actually because of various other kinds of interventions, but these could be some of the achievements that you can claim as brought by the WPS agenda in Nepal. Manuals were developed and training manuals, monitoring guidelines. Some of the policies, you can see some changes in the security sector, but nothing as such in other sector. It came as a neoliberal peace building project led by the civil society organization, even though it looked like Nepal government was leading it. Nepal government never allocated any budget. The NPTF was a basket fund created to build the peace, and out of that basket fund, which was funding was received by both from both government and non-governmental organizations, UN bodies, and put into that basket. From that basket fund, the NAB received a little bit of funding, and that was about it. And no other funding. NAB still, even though the civil society organizations and women's rights activists, they went to the Ministry of Peace and Reconstruction, thinking that this is not going to be taken as women's project, but it ended up being a women's project. The reason I'm saying it is that even when I went to the Ministry of Women, Children and Social Welfare, that's what it was called then. It has changed now. Senior citizen also has been added to that, because that ministry, as if didn't have enough to deal with. So when I went there, they said, "Oh, that project, it was 1 year project. It's been finished, and there is nothing to report." And that was the same response from everywhere else I went. Also, I'm now going into a little bit broader challenges. The WPS agenda in Nepal was understood in a very limited capacity. So it was defined only in terms of the civil war that happened during 2006 and 1996 and 2006. Other conflicts, various other ethnic conflicts took place soon after the peace agreement was signed. That was never part of the WPS discussion in Nepal. Changing context, Nepal, while the first NAB was still active, politically Nepal was very different. It became a federal structure, and NAB did not envision any political changes. Politics was seen as something static and never changing. Also, long-term impacts of conflict was never considered as part of the WPS agenda, and only like immediate needs were at least considered then through those projects. For instance, lots of women and girls displaced during the war, and they came to the capital city thinking they will hide somewhere and nobody will recognize. When they came, they could not bring any paper or documentation, and it was difficult for them to find any decent job. So many ended up in prostitution. One of the report actually says 19% of the female sex workers who were forced into sex work were the victims of conflict and displaced by the conflict. And likewise, these people who were victims of conflict were then again victimized or impacted by the earthquakes, and none of these were considered in the WPS agenda. Left behind people were never considered, children and their needs were never considered, likewise internally displaced people. When we talk about WPS agenda, obviously funding comes as something very important, and without funding you can't do anything. But then we don't think about the national context as such when we talk about conflict, when we talk about funding and the government's will. Nepali government, as you can see, high-level ministers and even deputy prime minister was involved. So you can see Nepal had actually given a lot of attention to the WPS agenda, and there was a will to do something. But funding was a problem, not because the government wasn't willing to do it, but then there is no funding. And most of the funding Nepal has, Nepal's budget goes into the activity that are already planned, and there is no other additional funding to cover these kind of activities. So most of the development funding comes from foreign aid, and these foreign aid have their own agenda. So if they do not allocate any funding, the Nepal government cannot allocate. And I also wanted to say that in the development of Nepal and any these kind of interventions, international organizations play a huge role. And as you can see here, number of NGOs and INGOs in Nepal and the money they bring to Nepal. But then in the WPS agenda, one thing I would like to say is that there were lots of projects implemented by the non-governmental organizations which were beyond the remit of the government or the projects funded by NPTF. But there is no accountability, or there is no record of it. So we don't know who brought how much money and what kind of projects were implemented and what was the impact of it. Also, NGOs tend to work in silos. Likewise, the ministries tend to work in silos. They do not coordinate with each other. So there was no real effort made to actually make some difference into the lives of people impacted by conflict. So NAB, actually, National Action Plan, actually became an end goal in Nepali. So NAB, if you look at the NAB, you can appreciate as much as you like, make it say it was very consultative and civil society organization was involved. It had all of the components that international organizations or the international community could recognize as a good practice, but in the end, it became an end goal in the context of Nepal. So I'd like to end here by saying that failure of NAB is not uncommon. Most countries emerging from conflict has limited resources and weak institutional structure. So really, what I'd like to say here is that the international community really has to now think about how they can support the government and just not make them responsibility and give them more responsibility to implement. But international communities now need to think about how they can better support the country who are coming out of conflict and how they can help them implement the WPS agenda. So what I'm trying to say is that the will of the government or political will is not enough to make this agenda effective and transformative, and more needs to be done. So as Swati already was saying, I also published a couple of articles on that. If you want to read more about it, you can also Google my name and find these ones. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Punam. Very, very comprehensive. And sorry that you can't hear our clap, so maybe you can. I've unmuted it, but that was wonderful. Thank you. Also, it's morning there, right? About 8:55, almost 9 o'clock there.
Yeah.
Thank you for taking us through all the specifics of what's going on in Nepal. And as you said, it's not uncommon. It's happening in other spaces as well. I think a key issue here is, the perception gap that we have about WPS everywhere when it is implemented. It's one thing to, between the two of you, you complement it so well. Laura talks about, how it's framed and what happens with the policy, and you talk about what the problems with implementation are. So I think we've really managed to cover that, bridge that so well. As you said, your work itself speaks. And for those of you interested in Nepal, Punam is always my go-to scholar for conflict, gender, and Nepal. Your work needs to be showcased and appreciated, and it takes a lot of work also to go there and stay connected to the region and write and do all the field work that you have. So really acknowledging that and appreciating it. And so once again, re-emphasizing that we have very distinguished women scholars who need to be appreciated for the work they do. So on that note, then I look at some questions. I have one question here, which because also I think we have just a few minutes left. One question that came was from Prerna, and the question is that during recent times, especially with the pandemic, we've seen its impact, especially affecting women the most. And so how do we address this problem as it's being neglected, right? So obviously there's not much attention to what's happening to women in this pandemic. How can we address that? And I think as feminist scholars, both of you are well equipped to take that on. So Laura, do you want to go first?
Sure, thank you. I think that part of the issue that we face is a general kind of invisibilization of the labor that women do in so-called normal times. And I think those gender inequalities have become even more stark and have been distributed even more unevenly in the times of the pandemic. I guess I'd like to comment on two specific issues that I think have been identified by feminist researchers and activists in the pandemic, and one of those is around the discourse of working from home and the way that contemporary political engagement with working from home by Western liberal governments tends to ignore the fact that it's a heavily racialized and also classed ability to work from home, which affects a lot of women who engage in care labor outside the home, and also service labor within the kind of service labor economy as well. And I think that the impact of the pandemic, as I said, falls disproportionately not only on women, but also on particular kinds of women and the roles that they play within society and their families. So I guess my plea would be always for a kind of intersectional analysis of how those effects and the gendered inequalities and the gender distributions of harm are unevenly distributed across society. And I think this is prominent in discourse around working from home, but not solely related to that. And I guess I'll stop there actually, because I know that we're short on time. So I want to give Punam a chance to respond to that also.
That's a great question, and there is no doubt that women are impacted everywhere, not only in Nepal but everywhere. For instance, when during the first lockdown, the government message in the UK was, "Stay home, stay safe." We need to question that. Is home a safe place for women? And the problem starts there: how the government is conceiving safety and security, and whether that's actually what does that mean for women. In Nepal, there are lots of data coming out, suicide among women, increasing suicide among women. So when the lockdown started in Nepal, I was following up and I was looking at the posts, and I'm also observing my own family, basically. So the first lockdown was like a party time for men and lots of work for women. It is not just the social structure, it's not the gender norms in the family, but also the way government sees what safety means and what problems are there. I organized one of the webinars last year. I organized several webinars, and in one of them I invited one of the heads of a maternity hospital in Nepal. She said her challenges, how it was difficult for her to be the head of that the hospital, but at the same time, how difficult it was for her to keep running the maternity ward during the lockdown, because they thought that was the least important. The important thing was taking care of the COVID patient, not something to do with childbirth or women. So these things, like these minuscule things, these are bigger issue for women, but it is not looked at, and it is seen as something very, very small.
Thank you, Punam. I'll just quickly take, just mention some of the questions here. And just to, again, mention that these are scholars who've done a lot of work. You can access both their works and perhaps even email to them if you want any specific information or you want to engage. So feel free to do that. There are questions on the climate change, right? How climate change is going to impact WPS, not just in South Asia, but also I think globally. That's one question. The other is related to how do we make governments accountable, because there is discrimination and governments think very differently. So how do we address that in a broad way, thinking through government policies and institutions? That was a question from Olina Pandey. And Keshav, of course, talked about climate change. And there was one question from Ayushri. And you talk about how COVID-19 has become a further challenge in Nepal with reference to domestic violence, right? So how do we, kind of address that? So maybe these are three questions that I can find here. There is one more, and perhaps we can also take that, and I'll give you, a round of response. Wouldn't the much bigger loss of employment for women as compared to men in recent times imply further gender inequality? So that's from Marjorie Fernandez. So shall we then take up some of these issues, perhaps tie them together and see what responses we come up with? So maybe Punam, do you want to go first this time? You can read the questions, Laura and Punam, on the chat, so feel free to respond to. Or maybe Laura, do you want to start? Yeah.
Sorry, I was just reading of the questions.
Yeah, I know. That's why I thought. Yeah, Laura, go ahead.
Yeah, that's fine. Let me just take a minute or two to respond to some of the excellent questions. I guess the first thing that I would like to say is that there's an emerging body of research that's linking climate degradation and climate justice to the Women, Peace and Security agenda, and recognizing that climate protection has been a part of women's peace activism historically for decades, that it's not a new issue for women's peace activists who have been working in this space for a very long time. And I think particularly in areas of the Pacific Islands, there's an effort to tie the way that specific forms of structural violence and inequality and development imperatives have a negative impact on the environment and on climate protections. And for the women activists in that region, this is indistinguishable from gender justice. This can't be separated from gender justice. And I think that it's now beginning to be recognized in the literature on the Women, Peace and Security agenda that security in all its forms, and I'm talking about the kind of the deep freedoms of human security, is inseparable from our need to live sensitively and in balance with our environment, which of course has been a message from, as I said, from women's activism for a very long time. And I think that this is now beginning to filter into policy circles, which I guess leads me neatly into the question of accountability. And I think that it's absolutely the case that we have to do, as citizens, as scholars, as activists, we have to do everything that we can to hold our governments accountable. And that accountability is multi-scalar. So it's accountability on a community level in terms of our own individual actions. It's accountability within society in terms of not condoning or permitting behavior that we find unacceptable in terms of gender relations, in terms of gendered harms and discriminations. And it's political accountability at the national and transnational level to hold our governments and our institutions accountable for the ability of every person to live with dignity and with full enjoyment of human rights. And I think the Women, Peace and Security agenda is a wildly imperfect framework. But even though I don't necessarily trust in the institution of the WPS agenda, I have every faith and every hope that the women's peace activists who nourish and sustain it will continue to fight for that accountability and continue to move us further towards gender justice and security. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
Great. I think we don't have a lot of time, but Punam, if you want to have a quick go.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for excellent questions. These are really bigger questions and difficult to answer, to be honest. And we somehow already know what the answer would be. Definitely, the silo that I mentioned is a problem for not only for the government and their approach in siloing various components, but also the international communities, UN organizations, civil society organizations, and also us as researchers. We don't talk to each other. We work in silos. So if I'm a climate change scientist, I would not do WPS agenda. If I'm working on WPS, I would not do climate change and would not even know. And these kind of disciplinary boundaries are also somewhat problematic. Because if you would like to do something on climate change suddenly, because you realize that it's an important thing and you know what the reality on the ground and you need to bring it up and raise awareness and you know what this means for the WPS, but then you can't do it because you do not fit into the climate change discipline and they would not accept if you're submitting something. So the silo is the main problem, and feminists are obviously trying to break these silos. As Laura was saying, there are new publications coming up looking at the WPS agenda and climate change. More work needs to be done. What does it mean? What does even climate change mean? And what kind of climate change is being considered when we talk about WPS agenda? So more questioning is needed. And another question by Ayesri was about domestic violence. Domestic violence has certainly increased. I mean, there hasn't been much study, but even some of the studies that are coming out during this pandemic shows that there is an increase in domestic violence. If you look at the data in the UK, BAME, Black and ethnic minority, Black and Asian ethnic minority communities in the UK, BAME community has been impacted more in the white. So the problem is everywhere, and the problem is not new. It is attached to the structural problem. It is attached to the entitlement. So men are entitled to to be their wives. So until we address and until we work towards the sense of entitlement, changing the sense of entitlement, this is not going to change. So it's a structural problem, and there has to be interventions to address those structural problems. And if we do not address that, it will keep coming, be it pandemic or any form of disaster. There was a question about employment inequality. Obviously, the answer is yes, as we all know. And again, it is linked to the structural causes. So yeah, I'll just stop there and then.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Punam. I think that we don't have a lot of time to address I can see two good questions from Gargi and one from Fatima. But as I said, please feel free to, get back to us and write to any of us. We'd be happy to take on your questions and address them. Okay, so that's great then. Thank you for that nice overview. As I had told Pramod, that if we had more than 2 speakers, it would be a crowd. I think we managed to really create a space where, you could, and it was a very nice balance of what's global and then what's happening at the level of Nepal. So I think it worked really well. So thank you very much, Laura and Punam, for your time and for these presentations, for taking on the questions, and perhaps you will get an email or two from so many people present here, especially those who couldn't reach out. I want to just say that feminist scholars are really nice, so reach out, send them an email. You will never be rebuffed, or you'd never not hear from them unless they're incredibly busy or haven't seen your email. So please reach out, right? So that's the good part of creating a community. And so with this, thank you again, Laura and Punam. And now my chair duties are over and I hand over digitally to the organizers. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I personally enjoyed the presentation very much because even I love to research on gender so much. So it was an enthralling presentation, to be very honest. Thank you, Punam ma'am. Thank you, Laura ma'am. And of course, thank you, Swati ma'am. You were a very good felicitator throughout. Thank you so much. And Nimesh, I'd like to hand over the session to you for the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Paki. So here is it.
Distinguished Chair, speakers, ladies and gentlemen, as we have come to the end of this session, we would like to express our sincere gratitude and thanks to the Chair for agreeing to chair and moderate the session today. Our sincere thanks also goes to all the speakers for being a part of the event and delivering such comprehensive and convincing presentations. We would like to acknowledge our gratitude to our friends from the diplomatic community, experts, academia, media, and different organizations. Finally, we must also mention our deep sense of appreciation for the audience who participated in the webinar and those who are watching us live. Thank you for your valuable time and attention and for making this session productive with your questions. Once again, we are truly honored to have you all with us today. Please do join us in the next session. Thank you so much.